Good afternoon, and welcome again to the 19th Century Charitable Association in Oak Park, where it is our vision to be a dynamic cultural center for community learning. I'm Deb W. Hammond, the Literature Chair. Our 30 programs in the Enrichment Series are part of our mission to strengthen our community through learning, giving, and sharing our landmark building. This program, as Mary Ann told us, is a part of our 7-program Japanese themester sponsored by a grant from Toshiba International Foundation. These programs in art, music, literature, science, and social science focus on increasing our understanding of Japanese arts and culture and Japanese American history. We worked with the Japanese American Service Committee to bring us this program about their oral history project, which collected stories from Japanese Americans who resettled in Chicago after their internment during World War II. Today we have presenters Mike Tanimura, Linda Suzuki-Wano, and Ross Hirano. And also present today is Tricia Su, the CEO of the Japanese American Service Committee, and several of their friends and family members. So welcome, Mike, who's going to introduce the rest of the presenters to us.
Thank you for including us in the 19th Century Charitable Association's Japanese themester to talk about the history of Japanese Americans in Chicago. Thank you all also for coming out on this incredibly frigid day. I'm Mike Tanimura, past president and current secretary of the board at the Japanese American Service Committee, or JASC. This is JASC new forever home on the northwest side of Chicago. From here, we continue our legacy of social service programs, including senior daycare and home support services, early education programs in Japanese language and culture, Japanese language classes, and Japanese language meetups. We have classes in Japanese cultural activities such as ikebana, flower arranging, and cooking. We also act as a community center where allied organizations hold programs and meetings, and we also host large community celebrations like Holiday Delight and Children's Festival each November. The building is also home to our Legacy Center, which acts as an archive and library for the Japanese American community's materials about their immigration, incarceration, and resettlement in Chicago. Erik Matsunago is a community historian who has done extensive research on Chicago's Japanese American community through interviews and research, primarily at the JASC Legacy Center and Newberry Library. Erik's investigations into the history of Chicago's Japanese American community have been featured by the Japanese American National Museum, Alphawood Gallery, WBEZ Radio, and the Newberry Library. Unfortunately, Erik is not able to join us today, so I'll be making his presentation. Back in 1940, there were only 462 Japanese in Illinois, with about 350 living in Chicago. The vast majority of Japanese lived on the West Coast. They often lived in urban and rural Japan towns, such as this map of pre-war California shows. They congregated in ethnic communities for the same reason all immigrant communities tend to do so: commonality of language, food, culture, and religion. At the time, there was also widespread racism against Asians in general and Japanese in particular, especially in California. Then came Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, which only made things worse. On February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 that allowed the military to forcibly remove anyone from an exclusion area on the West Coast. This, of course, only ended up being applied to people of Japanese ancestry, and about 120,000 people were forcibly removed from their homes. The poster, it notes that this order applies to all persons of Japanese ancestry, both alien and non-alien. About 2/3 of those incarcerated were non-aliens, or in other words, American citizens. The majority of those incarcerated were sent to 10 war relocation authority camps in the high deserts of the West or the swamps of Arkansas. By late 1942, adults that were deemed loyal to the United States were allowed to leave camp, as long as they didn't return to the West Coast exclusion zone, and if they had a sponsor who would help them find employment. Most of these sponsors were religious organizations in the Midwest and East. The War Relocation Authority, or WRA, touted Chicago as a good place to relocate to because of all the wartime job opportunities and its reputation for racial tolerance, at least when compared against other large cities. In this excerpt of minutes from a December 1942 meeting in the Poston, Colorado WRA camp, the WRA director of the Employment Division is warning Japanese leaders of the camp against congregating together once they are released. In Chicago, the small Japanese American community, which included people who were there before the war and those who had recently relocated from a WRA camp, along with the War Relocation Authority, social service agencies, and religious organizations, were preparing for the influx of Japanese Americans being released from the camps. During meetings of this coalition, they decided that an organization that could interpret the needs of these resettlers was needed to supplement the work of the WRA. The organization, which was formally organized in September 1945 and incorporated in August 1946, was the Chicago Resettlers Committee, which became the JASC after a name change in 1954. Their mission was to help those coming out of the camps resettle in Chicago. This meant helping them find jobs, housing, connecting resettlers to existing social and business services, interpreting, and helping them integrate into the larger society. This was no small job. The WRA employment director back in 1942 posited that Chicago could handle 2,000 or more without any trouble. By 1945, Chicago's population of Japanese Americans exceeded 20,000. Also, Corky, who was the first DD, was the only full-time employee for the first 2 years. He did have an office assistant and then just a bunch of people who volunteered. So going back a little bit, in January 1942, President Roosevelt had issued a proclamation that required all enemy aliens to register with the Department of Justice. They were issued these alien registration booklets. When people arrived from camp, the first thing they had to do was report in to the WRA office. So this one says, August 5th, 1944, reported in from Gila River. They were registered and given instructions like that they shouldn't congregate in large groups and weren't supposed to form a Japantown. Instead, assimilate within existing communities. Notwithstanding these directions, an unofficial Japantown grew in the Clark and Division area. Not coincidentally, both the WRA and the CRC offices were in that neighborhood. So back in the early 40s, this was a densely populated, economically blighted near North Side neighborhood. When the Japanese started settling there, they joined immigrant Italian and Polish families living in high-density tenement buildings and rooming houses. This was a redlined area and designated hazardous and blighted, which limited access to bank loans and insurance. This became one of the 2 unofficial Japantowns in Chicago immediately after the war. So this map, created by Erik, covers the Clark and Division neighborhood from the 1940s to the 1960s. There's 92 blue pins. Those indicate residential apartment buildings, rooming houses, and hotels owned by Japanese Americans. There's 80 gray pins, and they indicate Japanese American businesses. 20 yellow pins are associations or organizations. 17 green are recreation centers, and here he included taverns. There are 10 brown pins, and those were our doctors, dentists, and optometrists. 48 red pins represented Japanese restaurants and grocery stores, and 8 purple were for the churches. I should also say that back at this time, even if you were a Buddhist temple, you were a church. In the upper left-hand photo, that's LaSalle Mansion. It's a 160-unit boarding house that was purchased by the Kaneko family in 1944. They ran it for about 3 years during the height of the influx of Japanese coming to Chicago. It was located across the street from the Chicago Settlers Committee, so referrals were constant. People stayed days or months while they got their bearings. At right is the Morita family, pictured in front of the LaSalle Mansion. And in the bottom are advertisements for some of the restaurants in that area. The other unofficial Japantown that was established in the mid-1940s was in the Oakland-Kenwood neighborhood on Chicago's mid-south side near the lake. At the time, Oakland and Kenwood were changing neighborhoods. Once, they were affluent white suburbs just south of Chicago, but they were in economic decline. Part of that reason is because just north of them was Bronzeville, which is where
the heavy influx of African Americans coming up from the South lived. In these red line neighborhoods, African Americans, as well as immigrant German, Irish, and Jewish people were moving into older mansions, which had been subdivided into rooming houses, and single-family homes, which were converted to apartment buildings. Japanese resettlement was centered on 43rd and Ellis Streets, with most of the Japanese commercial enterprises along 43rd and 47th. This map covers the Oakland-Kenwood neighborhoods from the 1940s to 1950s. 77 gray pins are the residential apartment buildings, rooming houses, and hotels. 59 blue pins are businesses. 9 green are the doctors, dentists, and optometrists. 16 red are the restaurants and grocery stores. And the 6 purple are churches. At the top are some of the buildings in these neighborhoods that are still standing today. At bottom, some advertisements and a photo from the Japanese-owned Bob's Cafe. The Japanese could go one of two ways when they were naming their establishments, either to sort of lean into the Japaneseness or, in fact, their incarceration experience, like there was a Gila River restaurant, or you can become Bob's. Both of these unofficial Japantowns were transitional areas of resettlement. By the mid-1950s, urban renewal projects and increased racial tension between blacks and whites caused Japanese Americans in Oakland-Kenwood to move further south into Hyde Park and Woodlawn, or to neighborhoods in the far north side of the city. The same happened to those people who were living in Clark and Division. Many moved north up Clark Street into Lakeview, which by the 1960s was the home of the new unofficial Japantown, or even further north into Uptown and Edgewater. It should also be mentioned that after living in the city for 10 to 15 years, Japanese Americans were much more familiar with life in Chicago. They encountered less racism as the war became more distant, and they had gained in education and income. By the late 1960s and early 70s, many Japanese Americans were well enough off to become part of the white flight from the city to the suburbs. Erik asked many Nisei, they were the Japanese Americans who were born here of immigrant parents, where the Japantown is or was in Chicago. They all denied that one ever existed. So much thanks go to Erik for his research and generosity in sharing it with the community. I do want to add one postscript. One thing the War Relocation Authority, Chicago Resettlers Committee, and the vast majority of Japanese Americans in Chicago agreed upon was that the best and safest course for Japanese Americans was to integrate or assimilate with the majority culture as quickly as possible. Thank you. The JASC has for years collected oral histories from community members. We have recordings from elders in the community who lived through World War II and the incarceration. We also have oral histories from those in younger generations, and they help illuminate the longer-term impact of the wartime incarceration of their parents and grandparents. Here to discuss their family stories of resettlement and growing up in the Chicago area are Linda Kawano and Ross Hirano, and we're going to hear from Linda first. Linda Suzu Kawano's American-born parents resettled in Chicago, where they met, married, and raised 3 children on the city's north and northwest side. Linda will share her experience of negotiating life as a Japanese American in Chicago, her lifelong home. She is the founder of Group Optima and has a doctorate in biological science and experimental pathology from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Please, let's welcome Linda.
Thank you for having me today. It's quite an honor. So I'm going to share my story and how my parents came here and how they got here. They traveled across the country from the West Coast with a couple of detours. So it all started in Japan. And this is in 1904, my maternal grandfather, Soeto Nakagawa, immigrated to the U.S. from Tobase Island, which is not far from Nagasaki in Japan, to the Fresno area in California, a little town called Del Rey. He came here to grow grapes for raisins. And he went to high school. And in 1911, he graduated from Selma High School, a little larger town not far from Del Rey in California. And my story today is pieced together from things I found, not necessarily what my parents or grandparents told me. And this is a little date book that I found in my grandfather's chest. And because he went to high school in the U.S., he was able to speak and write in English. And so I could read it because I don't speak or write Japanese. And you can see that he went back to Japan in 1921 to Misumi port area, which is right by Tobase Island, his home. And he married my grandmother. And he brought her back to California, and they started growing grapes together. And they started their family in 1922, and there's my mother there in that picture with my uncle. But by 1936, my grandmother had died due to disease on the farm. And so my mother had to kind of raise the family as a matriarch. My paternal grandparents married in Tokyo in 1905 and immigrated to Medford, Oregon. And here's a picture of my father, Minoru, who was born in 1916 in Medford. But shortly thereafter, they went to Seattle, and that's where they settled. And my father was artistic, and he liked to dabble in art, and so this is a linoleum block print he made, but also he had a wonderful photo album that he put together, and those are some photos from there. And he, being in Seattle, the University of Washington is there, and it was a wonderful opportunity, he always said, because they could go to school, but you still required tuition. So he would go up to the salmon canneries in Alaska and make money during the summers for his his college tuition, which is very common for a lot of the Japanese Americans and, in fact, other Asians to do. In 1939, he graduated from the University of Washington. This is a photo from the Japanese Student Club. And then in 1939, my grandmother thought that it'd be better for him to maybe go to Japan to maybe use his degree, because the prejudice in the U.S. was not allowing a person with economics and a business BA in business to get a job. So she went with my aunt and my father to Japan, and they were all excited about it. And this is also from my father's photo album. But luckily, they got back in spring of 1941, and of course that's the year that Pearl Harbor occurred in December. So in 1942, the executive order was signed by FDR, and these signs went up in the spring of 42 all around the West Coast. My father and family ended up going to Puyallup Assembly Center because at the time they were evacuated, they didn't have the permanent relocation camps set up, so they put people into various temporary housing centers. They called them assembly centers. And he went to Puyallup. Puyallup is maybe an hour and a half or so drive from Seattle south. And while he was in Puyallup Assembly Center, he carved this chess set out of scrap lumber that he found lying around while they were building the stalls for the people. And this chess set was part of a wonderful exhibit called Art of Gammon, which celebrates all the beautiful creative works of the Japanese Americans that were created in the camps. But then by the fall of 1942, they were moved from Puyallup to Minidoka relocation camp, internment camp in Hunt, Idaho. So in California, my mother and her family went to the Santa Anita racetrack as their assembly center. This is outside of, or part of LA, I think. I think it's Arcadia, California. And that was in April of 42. And then by the fall of 42, they moved from Santa Ana down to Gila River, Arizona for their relocation or internment camp, Gila River. So in 1943, my mother did have a sponsor in Chicago and was able to get a way out of the camp. And the date is October 21, 1943. She left Gila River Relocation Camp for Chicago. And I found her date book, and there it is. She's going to Chicago on Thursday, the 21st. And she went to Ash Fork, which was a common hub, I understand, railroad hub for points east out of especially Arizona. And she arrived at Dearborn Station on Saturday. And she settled in the Clark and Division area. And here's a picture from her photo album, and her job was with in the dietary kitchen at Lutheran Deaconess Hospital, which I think was located in that area as well. And then in 1944, my father left his internment camp in Minidoka and went to New York. My aunt went with him. And there's a photo. He worked at the Taft Hotel as a night bookkeeper. But then in 48, he decided to move to Chicago because I think he missed his friends, and he got a job with a lithographer in Chicago. And by 1951, he met my mother, and they married. And they married at one of the chapels that would marry Japanese. And this was, it's still located down there on the University of Chicago campus in Hyde Park. And by 1943, I came along. They started their family. And then by 1953, and by 1956, my sister was born. And by 1959, we moved to Lakeview, and my brother was born in 1960. And then by 1963, we've moved to Albany Park. My parents cobbled together money and bought a house. We were very excited because it had a second floor. So Albany Park, that's where, my formative years, where I went to high school. My brother and my sister went to Roosevelt High School. Well, my brother went to Metro High School, if any of you know that school. It's experimental school in Chicago. And this Albany Park was quite, there were a lot of Jewish people living in Albany Park, and most of our neighbors were Jewish, and they're just really wonderful to us. They came over and greeted us and we became by culture Jewish. My mother's cooking brisket and all this, and my mother became a Tupperware dealer. And that was wonderful too, because I didn't realize until, you don't realize things about your parents until, unfortunately, after they're gone. But I realized she brought forth a tremendous opportunity to me, because she made me go with her to schlep her Tupperware. And, but we went all over the city, because one Tupperware party leads to another, and you don't know where they're going to go. And we met so many people, Native Americans, and we got beaded necklaces, and all kinds of people all over the city. But then by 1968, my mother had to go to work full-time, get work that would give her benefits, because my father lost his eyesight to a degenerative disease, and he had to quit working, and my mother had to go to work full-time. And so the Jewish neighbor down the street said, the rabbi needs somebody. And my mother went to work for the rabbi in the temple office with 2 other ladies for 10 years. And then she left eventually to get a job heading health and welfare at the largest Teamsters local in the country, I understand it, dock workers local, and near Rush Medical Center. So unfortunately, my mother died quite prematurely when I was 43, and my father had died a year before, well, 2 years before, and I didn't really got to talk to her about a lot of this stuff, but things that I tell you today are pieced together from things I remember looking at her photo albums and my father's, and I realized that through them, indirectly, I got resilience, and that's really what brings me here today. So thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Linda. Next up, we will have Ross Hirano. He's the former managing director of the State of Illinois Office of Trade and Investment. He has over 40 years of experience in helping private and public organizations in the areas of public policy, management, and finance. Ross currently serves as the managing director of EcoSolve Technologies, LLC. He has extensive involvement in public organizational activities and has served as president of the Illinois Ethnic Coalition and the Chicago chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League. He has also served as the treasurer of the Illinois Humanities Council and the board president of the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform. Ross served as the chair of the Commission of Asian American Affairs for the City of Chicago. In 1992, he was the first Asian American to be appointed as an Illinois elector for the Electoral College. In 1994, he was the first Asian American to run for statewide office in Illinois when he was a Democratic candidate for board trustee at the University of Illinois. Ross?
Thank you. My talk is from Hanford to Chicago. Hanford is a small farming town just outside of Fresno, California. I've never been there, but anyway, that's where my mother's family is from. And my father's family is from Berkeley, California. And I always wondered, but my father and mother met at a church conference. They had like 500 young Japanese American Nisei show up at these big rallies on the West Coast. And they met at this conference. When I found out it was a Christian church conference, I said, gee, Dad, I don't remember you going to church that often. So, and my mother confirmed that. So anyway, when Pearl Harbor was bombed and FDR issued Executive Order 9066, my mother and father were living in Berkeley because that's where all the Haranos were at. And she was very, very, very pregnant with me. So instead of evacuating out with my father's family, they moved back to Hanford, California, so that she could evacuate out with her family, because she had 3 sisters who could take care of me if I was born. We didn't know when I was born. I said that wrong. When I was born, we weren't sure what sort of conditions would be in these concentration camps. That's why she evacuated out with my mother's family. And this is a newsletter from the Fresno Assembly Center called The Grapevine. And way down in the lower, where you're looking at it, the lower left-hand side, there's an article about storks out for the baby derby. And that's the announcement of my being born behind barbed wire in Fresno, California. On a total different side note here, about 30 years later, I'm at a party. And some friends came in from New York, and one of the ladies or girls or ladies that came in was from New York, and we started talking. And somehow she said, well, she was in Jerome. I said, gee, so was I. I was in Jerome camp too. And she said she was in Fresno. I said, wow, I was in Fresno too. I was born there. She said, so was I. She said she was born September 17th. And I said, gee, I was born September 17th. And I thought she thought that I was hitting on her, but anyway, I wasn't. But anyway, this is the announcement of the two of us being born the same day in the Fresno Assembly Center. And we're behind barbed wire. I was born in September of 42, and by October of 42, I wasn't even a month old. They put us on a train and shipped us to Jerome, Arkansas. Jerome, Arkansas is down in the southeast corner of Arkansas, and they built two camps down there, Roar and Jerome. We were in Jerome, and here's a picture of me with my parents in Jerome, and you can see there's a tar paper shack back there. It's all tar paper. Here's another picture of my mother with her friends in Jerome. Same thing, tar paper. So then we only stayed there less than a year. In August of 43, we moved to Alton, Illinois, because my dad was able to get a job working in a farm. And so he did labor there. And this is my permit to leave the camp. So when he got the job, he was able to leave the camp, and me as a baby had to have this authorization to leave the camp. I was less than a year old, and this is my authorization. We went to Alton, Illinois, and there I am coming out of the shack again. And for the longest time, I really thought my parents were really poor. You know, I thought they were sharecroppers or something, because tar paper shacks and the way everything looked. I didn't realize, I didn't know about these camps until I was about 18. So when they talked about camp, I thought they were talking about church camp. So, because most of my parents' generation never talked about the camps. Never talked about the camps. What happened after that is that my dad was able to get a job in Chicago working for Bowman Milk. So we were able to move to Chicago. We lived on the west side of Chicago in Douglas Park. Lived in a big tenement area there. In fact, that was the first time that my mother had bed bugs. And so they had to seal off the room and light a sulfur candle in there to kill all the bed bugs. So they were trying to find a better place to live. And Chicago at the time was one of the most segregated cities, you know, in those days. Still is. So anyway, what happened is they're looking for apartments and they couldn't find any. They'd see a newspaper, there's a vacancy, they get there and they say, we don't rent to Japs. So it was very difficult. Finally, because of redlining in Chicago, redlining was really a collusion between the bankers and the real estate brokers. They would come in to a block and scare the hell out of everybody, and everybody moves, we'll buy your place, it's worth 10, we'll buy it for 8 because you got to get out of here. Well, that's what was happening on the south side. But we were able to find a house on the south side. This picture here was taken on the west side. And what happened was that my 3 aunties all got married, were married, and their husbands were coming back from the war. So we had to find a place to live. And we ended up on the south side of Chicago on Oakenwald, which was this building here. Oakenwald was the last block next to the lake on the south side. Our backyard was Illinois Central Tracks, and across that was the park and then the lake. We had at one time 14 people living in this house. There were 4 bedrooms on the second floor, and my uncle coming back from the war built a bedroom down the basement. We had 14. There were 11 adults and 3 kids. Actually, there were 11 adults and 1 kid. That was me for the longest time. And my auntie really spoiled me. I love the way they spoiled me. So this is the only picture that we have of the entire family. My mother's somewhere in the background. There's me on the front with my auntie. She was the one who spoiled me all the time. And then my grandmother and grandfather and my mother's brothers and sisters. That's the only picture that we have of the entire family. On the south side, our neighborhood was primarily German. German, and it was white, basically. Our block, there were no apartment buildings on it. It was all townhouses. And those are my friends from my 4th grade birthday party. These are my friends that I used to hang out with. This is my grandfather and me, and the background is the old Kenwood L, which used to run all the way downtown in those days. And this is my kindergarten picture. As you can see, the neighbors, it takes more than Oakenwall, but the south side where we live was primarily integrated at the time. That's my kindergarten. I'm the guy, I'm always on that side, and I'm always the shortest kid too. There I am on that side, the shortest kid. At that time, we still had several Japanese living in the neighborhood. There's Irene Janakuchi, Kenny Matsumoto, Don Shigeo, Pat Takagi, and Allison Adachi. So we were in 5th grade. The 5th grade teacher thought I was bright, so she skipped a grade for me. And I ended up, this is my 7th grade picture, and Wayne Fujiwara's and are the 2 Sansei kids in that class. And half those kids ended up going to high school with a lot of them, and we still keep in touch. This is my 8th grade picture, and there I am. Wayne moved. So I ended up going to Hyde Park High School, which at the time was the only integrated school in the city. And so it was a tremendous, tremendous school, one of the highest scholastically rated in terms of math. And so this was our 50th reunion, which took place back in 2010. So as you can see, it's still pretty much integrated. My claim to fame was not my grades. My claim to fame was I was the king of my prom. So there I am with Barbara Hill, who was also went to Oakenwall Grammar School with me. She also went to University of Illinois with me, too. This is the picture of the prom, my prom, and shows you how integrated Hyde Park High School was in those days. I'm wearing my crown. I still saved that crown. Anyway, I still have it somewhere. So this was Hyde Park, my prom. 1961, the city of Chicago decided to tear down our neighborhood and build projects there. So they tore down our neighborhood in 61, and we moved to Uptown, where we currently live. Those projects were on the lake front, and there were some questions about how can you have projects overlooking the lake? On the Sheridan Road, you pay all that money. So eventually, they were blown up, and they now are townhouses that they built down there. So that's the story of my pilgrimage, if you want to call it, from Hanford, California to Chicago. Thank you.
You mentioned in there when you were a baby that your uncles came back from fighting in the war. So they were fighting in World War II. And I don't know if you're able to, what you can share about that.
Yes. When Pearl Harbor was bombed, many of the Nisei are the 2nd generation American born. I'm Sansei, Ichi-ni-san, I'm 3rd, and then we have Yonsei, Gosei, so we're unusual in terms of immigrants because we count each generation because immigration was cut off so sharply. The Gentleman's Agreement in 1907, which stopped the males from coming in, and the 1924 Asian Exclusion Act, which stopped all Japanese from entering the United States. So when the war broke out, many of the Nisei were already in the Army, but they were segregated out. And then they didn't know what to do with them. Finally, in 1943, the Japanese-American community petitioned to serve in the armed forces, to fight for the country they belonged to. And so they were able to create a separate unit called the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which is made up primarily of the 100th Battalion, which were from Hawaii, And then the mainlanders, there were many Hawaiians already in the National Guard, had military training. So they were organized first and ended up serving in Europe first. Then the mainlanders were asked to volunteer, or were eligible for the draft. Many volunteered, and so the 442nd Combat Infantry Team was the highest decorated Army unit of its size in World War II. Still is, something like 18,000 decorations. I had 3 uncles who served in the 442. One was my mother's younger brother was wounded at Anzio, and my father's youngest brother was killed in France, rescuing the Lost Texans group. There was a battalion of Texans that got surrounded, and the Japanese Americans went in. They were called in to save them after 2 other groups couldn't do it, to rescue 140 some guys. There was about 800 casualties, and my uncle was killed on the last day. We also had in the Pacific the Military Intelligence Service. It was a military secret until the 50s, but what happened was that they were able to recruit Japanese Americans who spoke Japanese a little bit, and they went to a language school up in Minnesota. And they had a whole training program, just like the Windtalkers. You saw the movie about the Navajos. The same thing. They trained them, and they served in the Pacific. My uncle served in New Guinea, also in the Philippines, and they were able to interrogate POWs. They were able to intercept messages because the Japanese didn't know about them, and the Japanese military didn't speak in code. They didn't think that the Americans, U.S. Army, had translators. So it was a military secret for years that the Japanese Americans were on the front lines, interpreting, listening, clipping into the wires and listening into the Japanese transmissions. So they were able to, according to, was it MacArthur said that the Nisei in the Pacific shortened the war by 2 years. That's what he said, at least. He didn't mention the atomic bomb. Anyway, that's it about the Japanese Americans who fought in World War II.
And one thing is, a lot of the vets, when you talk to them afterwards, they consciously thought they were fighting for their relatives who were still being locked up in concentration camps. They thought by showing how American they were, by supporting the war efforts, that they would be able to get people out of the camps earlier. That tended not to happen. However, the valor of the Nisei vets absolutely went a long way for Japanese Americans to be accepted post-war.
My uncle had left the camp in Gila River in early 1945, and he came to Chicago, and he was drafted into the Army, served in the 442nd, but that also happened to people.
Both of you indicated that your parents did not talk to you about their experiences in terms of relocation, et cetera. Is that a general trend among the people in your generation, that their parents did not speak of this experience?
You're talking about the Nisei not talking about the camps? Yeah.
Yes, he was saying that the parents of your generation mostly didn't talk about the internment camps and their experiences. And was that your personal experiences?
Yes. As I said earlier, my parents never talked about camp. When they talked about camp, it was like church camp. Because once in a while, whenever they didn't want me to hear anything that was unpleasant, they spoke in Japanese.
But we always knew.
Well, we knew.
We always knew what they were saying.
Yeah, it was crazy because we always had a 3-generation house. My grandparents, my parents, and myself. Actually, when our kids were born, we had 4 generations. But yeah, when my cousin would always say, I always thought my name was Yakamashi. Yakamashi means quiet, too much noise. So that's about the limit of my Japanese. So anyway.
It was the same with my parents. They didn't really talk about the camp, but when Japanese Americans would get together, they'd always ask, what camp was he in, right? Camp always formed the structure for their life. And I think especially true in Chicago, because everyone was away from the West Coast. My parents, I remember my father saying they served them shark meat. But my father always was a pretty light-hearted guy, and I think he used to always find something positive. One thing he said, and I don't know if it's, he said that the moving out of Japantown in Seattle was helpful in a way because he got to see the rest of the world and it gave him more opportunity. And East, it was certainly true that I think there was less prejudice. There was prejudice, but I think the further you went from the West Coast, there was less, and especially in New York. And so, but yes, they never talked about camp. Certainly nothing terrible about camp.
Yeah, one of the things that, again, they really wanted our generation to be able to be integrated in with the larger society. We were raised to be Americans. We were not raised to be Japanese. You know, so I think most of us, for the longest time, yes, we're Americans of Japanese descent, just like I had friends who were Polish, Irish, German, whatever. But you weren't Japanese. And by not talking about the experiences, especially about the negative experiences and how it affected them, was a way to shelter us from that so that we wouldn't go, you know, that would stop us from just being a part of the regular culture.
I was surprised to hear that there was so much discrimination here in Chicago against the Japanese. I had no idea. I remember when I moved to the city, to Chicago, I was going to the YMCA at Belmont and Lincoln, which took in, you know, Lakeview. And I was the first time I learned more about the camps, was talking to the Japanese women over at the YMCA. But I did not know that there was a citywide discrimination against the Japanese.
There was, but again, it was still better here than Detroit, Cleveland, New York, and any other places.
I grew up in Lakeview, and there really was sort of a Japantown. It was from Clark and Belmont to Clark and Addison to Wrigley Field. And there's one piece of it left. It's called the Nisei Lounge. It's at Sheffield, where Sheffield and Clark come together. I'm wondering if you all know anything about that particularly wonderful dive bar.
I went to high school with Emi Yamauchi, and her father owned Hamburger King, which was an establishment right next to Nisei Lounge. As I understand it, Nisei Lounge thrives, but I don't think it's run by Japanese.
No, it's no longer owned by Japanese, but the current owners have said they want to keep the bar the way it is, and they want to keep the history of it alive. So that's really wonderful. It was a place that Japanese Nisei, second generation, could go and hang out and be comfortable. So of course back then, having your neighborhood tavern that you went to was a ritual for many people. And still post-war, they didn't necessarily feel safe or welcome at, you know, other bars. But the Nisei, the lounge, it allowed them to gather together. There are also the stairs to go up to the apartments was in between Hamburger King and Nisei Lounge, and also there's health code things about you can't have food in the bar and you can't have drinks in the restaurant, but there actually was a back door, and they would just go back and forth through them.
The whole evacuation process is still constitutional. The Supreme Court ruled in all 3 separate Supreme Court cases that rounding up people on the basis of race is constitutional, and that's what they did. Even though the Army hid there was a report that the Japanese were not a military threat, and that was hidden. In fact, they were supposed to burn that memo, and I guess only one memo was found, and that became part of the basis from when we did seek redress and reparations. But also the 3 Supreme Court cases were reviewed in Northern California, but didn't touch on the basic issue: can people be rounded up on the basis of race? What it did is said that these 3 individuals should not have been prosecuted, and they were pardoned as they should have been, shouldn't have been brought before, shouldn't have been arrested in the first place. But anyway, but the whole issue of rounding up people based upon race is still constitutional.
That there were like 600 or 362 Japanese in Chicago. What happened to the 20,000 that, I mean, where have they gone?
Well, so oddly enough, we still have 20,000 Japanese or Japanese descendants still here in the Chicago metro area, only now it's split about evenly between descendants, Japanese American descendants of people who were at camps, and now, since then, when they opened up immigration back in 1965, to new Japanese immigrants and their descendants, as opposed to somewhere like New York, where 10% of the Japanese are descendants of Japanese Americans who are incarcerated, and 90% are newer immigrants. But the population's always stayed at about 20,000 since that time. But you can imagine if you were one of the few hundred here and you knew what was going on, and you knew that the WRA is telling people, yeah, you should come to Chicago. There was absolutely no support. They had to do something, so that's why our organization was formed.
You haven't mentioned about what the Japanese lost when they were incarcerated. They lost their homes, all their property, didn't they?
So when those notices that we showed went up, they gave you anywhere from 6 days to 2 days, depending on what area, to gather and get to the center to be forcibly removed. That means you had 6 days or 2 days notice to liquidate your lives. There were also a long list of prohibitive things. You couldn't bring anything that was related back to Japan. You weren't supposed to have anything that was in Japanese writing. You were supposed to bring your bedding. You also were limited to what you could carry, and there was a weight limit of 65 pounds, I think it was. So you had to reduce your life to under 65 pounds and what you could carry. People sold their businesses for literally cents on the dollar. People gave away their automobiles. People sometimes killed their pets because you couldn't bring your pets with them. Yeah, it was a loss of everything up until that time, which is one reason that there was redress sought later. And Ross, I believe you were part of the redress movement, weren't you?
In 1970, at the Japanese American Citizens League National Convention in Chicago here, a resolution was passed to seek redress and reparations for those who were incarcerated during World War II. It took a long time. It took a long time just for us to figure out what we wanted to do. We didn't know. Some folks said, well, we want an apology. Some folks said, well, you got to have a little dough behind it to make it stick. And there was issues of how much, who would qualify. All these issues took a long time. It took us 10 years to get a consensus within our own community at what should be done. Some folks said we need to get, the Bank of America said every individual would have lost $40,000 in 1942 money, and it brought it up to whatever it is now. I'm sorry, from 1942 to 1980, it would have been $40,000, which would have been for 120,000 people. That's a lot of dough. So there was a lot of discussion, and finally, it ended up being $20,000 for those who are still alive. And in 1988, August 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed into law the bill to provide redress and reparations, and the appropriations took a while, so my letter was from George Bush. The one thing about this whole redress and reparations is that it was the issue now in terms of what's going on within the African American community is they're talking about redress and reparations. And many of the Japanese Americans who are actively involved in that whole issue for us are actively involved with the African American community in terms of the way that we did it. We did it by having a presidential commission created to look into this whole matter, the whole issue. And the commission came out with a report on what took place, that it was not a military necessity, and here are the losses. That was an official congressional report, and then that allowed us to introduce legislation saying, support the report. So it was an official government report saying what took place, and the recommendations were in it. So it took a long time, but we were able to get congressional support of it, and it was passed in both the House and the Senate. The Senate was easier than the House, and that's when Ronald Reagan signed the bill into legislation. Some folks didn't even cash a check, by the way. Some folks did not even do that. Some folks, we all got letters, a letter of apology. One mine came from George H.W. Bush, and I appreciated the check. I made a copy of it, but I cashed it.
When my parents got their check, my brother, who's kind of an activist, said, you should donate that money to the Japanese American Citizens League, JASCL. And my mother said, hell no, I'm keeping it for myself.
So I'm an immigrant, and you guys are not. You've been here many generations already, right? A couple of three generations. I'm interested in what has happened over time in terms of intermarriage. If that is common in the Japanese community or very uncommon.
So the Japanese outmarry at the highest rate of any ethnic group in the United States. Anecdotally, if you were born before the camps or in camp, your marriage, at least your first marriage, 90% of the time, you married another Japanese. If you were born post-camp, for those here in Chicago, anecdotally, 80% of us outmarried. Whoa. Okay, because we're Americans first, we're Japanese second or third or whatever. And so it used to be that our Nisei parents would be like, oh, half-halves, or they adopted the Hawaiian term happa. Of course, until it was your grandchild, then it was much more acceptable. My daughter and many of those in her yonsei, the fourth generation, they don't think of themselves as being half anything. They're multi-ethnic, They want to be able to claim all of their histories and all of their culture. And so for them, it's a positive, not a negative. Do you guys?
Interracial marriage. When I was a teenager, way back, the issue that we would have at our youth conferences was, am I Japanese or am I American? And I'm a teenager, and I'm American. But really, I look back, we're really saying, am I Japanese or am I white? We really were saying that in an indirect way. You'll find that most of my generation, 80% have intermarried. All my cousins, except one, did. Of course, they lived in North Platte, Nebraska, and they had to go to Kansas to get married because they had anti-miscegenation laws until 1967. So all my Nebraska cousins would come to Chicago to get married or go to Kansas to get married. But our family, when I look, we have a Harano reunion every 2 years since 1975. And all the cousins that are married, and we have blue-eyed. My great-granddaughter has blondish hair and blue eyes, so we really do well when we create a mixed blood child. I think we turn out some great ones. They're brighter than I am, that's for sure.
hybrid vigor. That's what biologists would say. In my case, I think our parents were really successful in getting us to assimilate. And we think of ourselves, like Mike said, Ross, we're Americans. And as Americans, we all have a lot in common, and we like a lot of stuff. And in my case, I liked a lot of food, not just Japanese foods. In fact, growing up, I preferred hamburgers and hot dogs. So I don't know if that's how I met, why I'm married to a Caucasian guy, Chuck, over there. But it's because we're Americans, and we just kind of think about things all mixed up. At least we used to, and as a good thing.
Okay, thank you all for coming, and let's thank our presenters.
Thank you for having us.